what lies in store for banks in the near term. Let's discuss that and debate that with two fine gentlemen, Special Associate of ISL and Leif Eskesen. He is President HSBC.
Performance for the banking sector is likely to continue according to Prashasta, especially in the short term. But Leif, I'm going to focus on the macros. We had the inflation numbers at 7.5%. You had core inflation, which stabilized at about 5%. Do you think there's a risk of core inflation rising in the near term? Because, you've had the rupee depreciation and oil prices, which are also on the upside. At what levels do you see the rupee and global oil prices eating into inflation?
Yeah, there certainly is a risk that inflation will remain elevated over the next couple of quarters and actually indeed could increase over the next couple of quarters. Of course, you still have tight domestic capacity, as I mentioned earlier, because the supply side constraints still being in place. You're also going to have the lagged effect of the easing of the exchange rate, so the depreciation of the exchange rate adding to imported cost inflation pressures. In addition to that, of course, you have the likely increase in diesel and kerosene prices, which is needed to contain the fiscal deficit. That would also add to inflation. And then finally, of course, you have the indirect taxes were hiked in the budget. That could also eventually spill through to broader inflation pressures. So we actually see inflation holding up at above 7% for the next several quarters and actually ending the fiscal year above 7% on the back of these factors. Core inflation might come off a little bit toward the end of the fiscal year, but not by a great deal. On the rupee itself, we see it as one of the more vulnerable currencies in the Asian region at the moment because of the twin deficit, the slowdown in growth, the lack of progress in structural reform, and lingering inflation pressures. So it could actually depreciate further during the course of 2012, potentially to as much as 57% by the 57 level by the end of this year. A lot depends, of course, on what happens in Europe and the extent to which the situation there will improve or not. If you have more of an improvement on that front, easing in global risk aversion, of course, that could help. But you also need to see progress on the domestic side in India to tackle the key issues that I mentioned earlier.
Right, so at HSBC, what are your GDP estimates for FY13?
I think from our perspective, our forecast for this current fiscal year is for 6.2% growth. In next fiscal year, we're looking at 7.4% growth, so in all cases below the pace of growth India has been accustomed to in the past. And as I said, it's primarily because you have supply constraints in place that need to be eased through deeper structural reforms. You could even have that the next quarter is going to be below 6% as well before we start to move up during the final 3 quarters of the fiscal year. However, that's also contingent on there being some progress on supply side reform, structural reform. It's also contingent on the situation in Europe gradually improving, and thereby you'll see some easing in some of the negative spillovers you've seen from the external front as well. If that doesn't happen, if policy paralysis persists in India, if we have a persistent crisis in the Eurozone or even worse, an escalation, that would of course also have knock-on effects on the growth outlook for India.
Leif Eskesen, thanks very much for joining in with that perspective on the macroeconomic data.